Welcome. Welcome to everyone here. My name is Kerr O'Brien and I'm the Vice Principal for Education at King's College London, and it's my great pleasure to welcome you all and to introduce Michael Kerr, our inaugural lecturer, who's going to give a lecture entitled Conflict and Coexistence in Deeply Divided Societies. Michael Kerr came to King's College in 2008. He originally did his BA in politics at the University of Essex and was for a long time at the LSE as a master's student and as a PhD student, and subsequently as a Leader Hume Research Fellow. So we were very, very fortunate and very clever, I think, to capture him from the LSE of King's College London, and obviously has relatively recently become a professor. He's Professor of Conflict Studies, Director of Middle East and Mediterranean Studies Programme, and also Director of the Centre for the Study of Divided Societies. Michael's work spans a really broad frame of comparative politics, so he's written books about Northern Ireland, about Lebanon and about Syria, and he's thought across globally about issues of conflict in divided societies. His work has had already, I think, a significant impact in the policy-making world, not least through the work he's been doing as part of his Conversations on Diplomacy series, which was a joint programme and discussion project between Michael and his staff, the Foreign and Commonwealth Office, and the Middle Eastern diplomatic community in London. And those conversations were how to apply the lessons of Northern Ireland and elsewhere in the world, Bosnia-Herzegovina and elsewhere in the world, to current situations in Lebanon and particularly in Syria. So what Michael's work shows us is comparative politics truly in action. What can the comparative political approach bring to different settings? What can be learned from lost opportunities in the Northern Irish case, as well as taken opportunities? What makes states ungovernable? And how can we bring to bear the academic perspectives of comparative politics in a truly practical way? So we're very much looking forward to hearing Michael's lecture. After the lecture, we're going to have a vote of thanks from Rory Miller, a former director of the Centre for Middle Eastern Studies. And after that, you'll be very glad to hear that you're all very warmly invited to drinks and chapters afterwards, and we'll be aiming to end something like 7:30. So, as is the tradition with inaugural lectures, we won't take formal questions, but if you have questions for Michael, I know that he'll be very, very willing to talk more during the drink session afterwards. So please join me in welcoming Professor Michael Kerr.
Thank you, Karen. Thank you very much, Karen, and thank you very much, Rory, in advance. I'm delighted to see so many here tonight, and family, friends, colleagues, old colleagues, and students and new students and old students. I'm not going to begin by making a lengthy speech displaying my gratitude to everybody here that I owe a debt to, because there are many of you. But instead, I will just say thank you to some absent friends, and that is Andrina Mitchell, Fred Mitchell, and Julia Kerr, because I wouldn't have got very far in life, never mind in my academic life, if it hadn't been for their support and encouragement and love. So thank you to them. It's a great pleasure for me to be giving my inaugural lecture as part of the School of Arts and Humanities Festival. This year's theme is Being Human, and which seems to me to be a particularly fitting rubric for what I want to discuss this evening, and that is the idea of putting in place power-sharing arrangements to regulate political violence between different ethnic, ethno-national and religious communities in deeply divided societies. Tonight I want to focus in on what that idea means to parties who are locked in ethnic conflict, on the role played by external governments or third-party states in the international negotiating processes that lead to power-sharing arrangements, and how they may, if indeed they can, be consolidated in the long term. In doing so, I shall focus again on a couple of hard cases that are close to my own research. That is Northern Ireland and Lebanon, where power sharing has been applied and reapplied, where it has succeeded and failed, where it has been tried and tested, because I think these two cases are particularly instructive for policymakers who are considering the imposition or use of this method of conflict resolution or regulation elsewhere in the world. I should also begin by saying that it is a pleasure for me to be competing for your attention tonight with one of my great heroes, and that's the Prince of Denmark. I'm sure that some of you will have noticed that Shakespeare's Hamlet is being screened live from King's and from the National Theatre tonight, a play about the human condition in which perhaps the most famous protagonist of all is driven to madness by his desire to take revenge against his uncle Claudius for the treacherous murder of his father. In reading Hamlet, one might reach the conclusion that being human is itself at the core of the dilemma that sharing power represents to peoples and communities in deeply divided societies. And by that I mean states or territories that are contested, where the leader of one community views the slightest political gain on the part of a rival community as a loss intrinsically for their own. Unsurprisingly, perhaps, leaders of communities in contested territories have tended to view the sharing of political power as a particularly risky venture. They do not easily or readily engage in this process, but they require incentives, motivations, and very often international guarantees. Unlike power struggles in consolidated liberal democracies, where there is broad agreement over the state and the institutions of the state, in deeply divided societies, power struggles are often viewed in zero-sum terms, where the winner takes all. This sort of compromise almost always requires leaders to make sacrifices on core principles, sacrifices which they are subsequently required then to sell to their own communities as something not only worthwhile, but intrinsically valuable to their future and to building a shared future, a shared society. New power sharing arrangements are also likely to be largely reliant on the states that brought them into being and on the continuity of the regional or international equilibrium that defined those states, the new state. Take, for example, Iraq. The superpower that established its present power sharing arrangements has militarily withdrawn from the scene, which now leaves the Iraqi government open to the manipulation of other regional powers, such as Iran, which holds a great influence over the majority Shia community there. And I think it is rather safe to say that the United States did not intend to be sharing power with Iran in Iraq when it led the 2003 invasion. Another more positive example is Bosnia. Its power-sharing arrangements are externally regulated. They are overseen and implemented by the High Representative for Bosnia-Herzegovina, which is comprised of officials from the states that negotiated the Dayton Accords in 1995, which ended the Bosnian Civil War. So what that means in practice is that EU and US officials actually have the power to take binding decisions over Bosnia when local actors fail to act. In the late 1980s, when the prospect of sharing power between Northern Ireland's Protestant and Catholic communities, Unionists and Nationalists, looked particularly bleak, one nationalist negotiator from the Social Democratic and Labour Party, Seamus Mallon, I think it was, asked David Trimble, who went on to negotiate the Belfast Agreement, or Good Friday Agreement, "What is it that you want for your people?" Trimble said to him, "To be left alone." Power sharing usually occurs in deeply divided societies when communities in conflict cannot exist alone, cut off from the rest of the world, when they come to a point of realization that a shared future is the most pragmatic method of preserving their aloneness. whatever autonomy that they may enjoy, and preserving their national, religious, and cultural identities for the generation that will come after them. That is the realism of sharing power in a divided society. It involves letting go of some of the certainties of protracted ethnic conflict when there is no winner and when no winner emerges, and investing their political capital in a process that brings a new form of constitutional government to the contested state. And that means practicing the politics of consensus. This very often marks a significant disjuncture from the principles that were hitherto held sacred by a community through its nationalist or religious belief system and reinforced through its identity-forming narrative. The high watermark of success would be the evolution of some form of overarching identity that led to the formation of a power-sharing government that worked for a divided society as a whole, rather than parties to a divided society simply working within a power-sharing government for their own communities alone. Now, arguably, Northern Ireland has embarked on the road to such a future, but there are definitely different pathways from that road, and the shared society on the horizon should not be taken for granted. The idea of sharing power is not a new one, but since the end of the Cold War, adopting power sharing in attempts to regulate political violence in divided societies, or consociational democracy, as it is otherwise known, has become a policy favoured by the international community. When, how and why power sharing arrangements are put in place has a great bearing on the chances of them succeeding in regulating political violence. Although it doesn't presently seem likely that power sharing will be the outcome of the civil war that is presently taking place in Syria, it would be very difficult indeed for the international community to impose some form of power sharing on Syria if the Assad regime collapsed and different sectarian militias, backed by rival regional states, controlled pockets of the country. So power sharing is much more difficult, I'm saying, to implement when the policy comes as an afterthought in a belated attempt to fill the political and security vacuum that arises following the collapse of a long-established hegemonic order. There were no significant political or security institutions upon which a power-sharing government might have been built in Iraq immediately after 2003. They had all been removed. Thus, there were no institutional foundations nor a culture of democracy upon which to build a new shared future amongst its peoples, most notably the Sunni, the Shia, and the Kurdish communities. I began thinking about the idea of power sharing when I came to London as a student in 1998, the year that the Belfast or Good Friday Agreement was brokered between some of the main parties to Northern Ireland's conflict and the British and Irish governments under the chairmanship of US Senator George Mitchell, who I'm very glad to say received an honorary doctorate from King's in 2011 for his endeavours to bring peace to divided societies. That is something that my colleagues and I in MEMS are very proud of for the study of comparative peace processes, particularly Northern Ireland and Middle Eastern cases, is a key component of our MA programmes. Now, coming from Belfast and having fought two Westminster general elections, one in 2001, the other in 2005, as an advisor to Nobel Peace Prize winner David Trimble, who was occasionally First Minister of the Northern Ireland Executive during that time, I think I might be forgiven for approaching this subject with extreme caution. Selling the theoretical idea of power sharing to a sceptical public and sustaining a political process that brings about its implementation is a particularly difficult venture. And I don't mind telling you that many members of the public during those elections were not a bit interested in what I had to say about power sharing, but were quite willing to share with me their dislike of the notion when I knocked on their doors and asked them to support the Northern Ireland institutions. Machiavelli suggests in The Prince that it ought to be remembered that there is nothing more difficult to take in hand, more perilous to conduct, or more uncertain in its success than to take the lead in a new order of things. Yet taking the lead in a new order of things is precisely what is required from leaders who sign up to power-sharing agreements in deeply divided societies, where there is no consensus over the state. In abandoning an old order, they must invest all of their political capital in the new, or so the theory goes. They find themselves in a position where sharing power and constructing a new form of government must secure their own community's future. Now, having invested in that process, they then in turn become reliant for their own political survival on the new institutions that have been put in place, on the parties to the agreement that they have made and share power with, and on the external states that brought that new form of government about, that created those institutions. Now, having said that, I was rather surprised a couple of years ago after giving a short lecture on power sharing to a rather large group of 11-year-olds at my son's school. I asked them, could they give me any examples of power sharing? The first boy immediately made reference to the Magna Carta, the second to the European Union, the third to the Lib Dem Conservative Party coalition that's governing the country, and so on. So perhaps it's not that difficult an idea to grasp after all, or perhaps it is just easier to sell the notion of power sharing to 11-year-olds who live in Essex rather than Belfast, Beirut or Baghdad. There is an important debate over the academic theory and practice of consociational democracy, the suitability of using power-sharing arrangements to regulate ethnic conflicts. But the practice of power-sharing long predates that debate in places such as Lebanon and Switzerland. Some critics, however, have viewed this as a rather sterile form of government. In the film noir adaptation of Graham Greene's classic, The Third Man, Harry Lime, played by Orson Welles, comments that in Italy, for 30 years, under the Borgias, they had warfare, terror, bloodshed, but they produced Michelangelo, Leonardo da Vinci, and they had the Renaissance. In Switzerland, they had brotherly love, 500 years of democracy and peace, and what did they produce? The cuckoo clock. Now, those of you from Switzerland will know that that's not exactly true. I think it came from Germany. I'm sure my Uncle John could correct me on that later. In fact, the academic debate between those who argue that power sharing is the most realistic method of regulating political violence that stems from ethno-national tensions, and those who insist that this method actually institutionalizes sectarianism and further fragments society, is as polarized and divisive as many of the conflicts in question. It is reminiscent of an oft-told story about former Irish Prime Minister Garret FitzGerald, who was an academic at heart. When holding a late-night meeting with a group of exasperated civil servants about some policy or another, he apparently remarked that he could see perfectly well how it worked in practice, but was at a complete loss as to how it would work in theory. To a large extent, the theory comes from the practice. Dutch political scientist Arend Leipart developed consociational theory in the 1960s and 70s by looking at how we might achieve and maintain stable democratic government in countries with deep religious, linguistic, cultural or ideological divisions. He used European cases, and we might describe them as soft cases, of Austria, Switzerland, Belgium, and the Netherlands, where democratic pluralism had been successful and where there was a culture of power sharing. Irish political scientists Brendan O'Leary and John McGarry further developed this theory in the 1990s by applying it to the hard cases of ethnic conflict, in the first instance, Northern Ireland. And they argued that this was the most realistic means of regulating the Troubles, despite its failure in the past. And I was quite convinced. But we should remember at this time that the Northern Ireland Troubles were viewed as rather anachronistic, when in fact they probably should have been seen as a portent of things to come in the post-Cold War world, as we are all now very familiar with ethnic conflict. O'Leary defined consociation as a state or region within which two or more cultural or ethnic or national communities peaceably coexist, with none being institutionally superior to the others, and in which the relevant communities cooperate politically through self-government. Now, not all power-sharing arrangements meet those lofty criteria, but this is certainly a definition that we can all agree upon. The principal features of this system are the establishment of a grand coalition between the parties, mutual vetoes on constitutional issues, a proportional electoral system, and political autonomy where it is possible for the different communities in conflict. Now, for the proponents of power sharing, this debate has traditionally focused on the different internal variables, on the characteristics of the conflict in territory that makes power sharing more or less viable, such as the existence of overarching loyalties to the state amongst rival groups, a history of power sharing between its elites, the geographic isolation of the different communities, or an existing balance of power between them. My research on Northern Ireland and Lebanon led me to take a different approach to this subject, which has served to refocus that debate away from simply looking at these internal dynamics, instead examining the external actors that make or break power-sharing arrangements and play a role in bringing them to life. Through that body of work, I have argued that if power-sharing agreements are to successfully resolve or regulate ethno-national conflicts, then there must be positive external pressures from the states or non-state state actors that brought those arrangements into being. The external states must provide the incentives and motivations for leaders of communities trapped in ethnic conflict to accept and support new consociational arrangements. They must be consistent if a new order is to be established, and if at all possible, as was the case in Northern Ireland in the late 90s, they should act with a unity of purpose in policing power-sharing arrangements, for the parties to those new arrangements or agreements are highly dependent upon them for their survival. More than that, if power-sharing is to succeed, those states that hold an interest in that society should also hold an interest in establishing and nurturing that form of government as an interest in and of itself, something which is consistently or generally lacking in many of the hard cases. To put it another way, even if many of the internal variables that enhance the chances of power sharing succeeding are in place, should external states simply be pursuing their own selfish, strategic, economic interests or rivalries through a divided society, then its power sharing agreements cannot stabilise, and the society will remain prone to civil war and ethnic violence in the future. So it is a two-way process, and increasingly so, as few states in this globalising world can live in isolation from their proximate environment. Most divided societies, deeply divided societies, are not geographically similar to Switzerland in that they do not have mountains for borders with which they can resist unwelcome interference. Northern Ireland's recent peace process and its current political process are defined by positive external relationships, principally the British and Irish governments working together to promote power sharing through the good offices of the United States government. There would have been no power sharing agreement in Northern Ireland if it had not been for this external support. That is exactly why this hard case is so important and instructive for the theory and practice of ethnic conflict resolution, and for policymakers hoping to replicate its successes elsewhere in the world. Now, the policy of power sharing previously failed Northern Ireland, or a cynic might say, Northern Ireland failed it. There is much truth, I think, in the wise words that peoples often attain exactly the form of government that they deserve. 15 years after the Belfast Agreement, and although still facing many difficulties in consolidating its power sharing arrangements, Northern Ireland has come a very, very long way from the political violence that tore the province apart in the 1970s, 80s and 90s. With that experience in mind, I want to illustrate why this case is so important when considering other hard cases, such as Lebanon, Iraq, Bosnia, or perhaps even Syria in the not-too-distant future. The story of how the policy of power sharing was implemented in Northern Ireland by the principal actors to those arrangements, the British and Irish governments, goes a long way in explaining its failure in the 1970s and its success in the 1990s. Whenever I first began conducting research on Northern Ireland, I asked myself the question, why did power sharing agreements fail in the 1970s? And given its failure then, why was the same formula and method applied to regulate the Troubles in the 1990s? I soon discovered that exactly the same question could have been asked of Lebanon or Bosnia. A decade later, with very different power sharing arrangements, regulating conflict in each of those divided societies, I returned to the Northern Ireland case and wrote a book that examined exactly what the idea of power sharing meant to the different parties to that conflict, a question that had not been addressed in the literature. In that book, which charts the rise and fall of the policy of using power sharing to regulate Northern Ireland's troubles, I asked another question. In what order does a state decide to abandon a legitimate constitutionally formed government, or remove another government from power, and seek to replace it with a form of administration that better serves its interests? How does a state go about preparing a society for regime change and a new system of governments? And what are the limitations to intervention of this nature? So I was really asking, with respect to Northern Ireland, in what order did the British government decide to abandon the Stormont Parliament in 1972, and what political risks was it prepared to take to establish a new order there? This is a question of great importance to the study of international relations and the history and politics of third-party intervention in divided societies in contested regions, Iraq being a particularly obvious case, and perhaps Syria also, again. And I found that the contrasting approaches that were taken towards the use of power sharing in Northern Ireland, first by the Conservative Prime Minister Edward Heath, and then by his successor, Labour Prime Minister Harold Wilson in the 1970s, offered a compelling example of the complexities of applying consociational democracy to a divided society in which there was absolutely no consensus whatsoever over what the actual objective of power sharing was, where there was lukewarm domestic support for the notion, and where the external parties to the conflict lacked the political power, and in Wilson's case, the political will, to fully implement and police new institutions. So what I discovered largely explains the failure of power sharing in the 1970s and its success today. For power sharing arrangements to succeed, those states that are at the centre of its negotiation its implementation, its renegotiation, the policing and the consolidation of those arrangements, they must have an interest in conflict resolution that is at least as important as the national, geostrategic, political or economic interests that they have in that contested territory. Now, that was simply not the case in Northern Ireland in the early 70s. And nor at the end of Lebanon's civil war in 1989, which I'll come to later. But it certainly was the case in 1998, when the Belfast Agreement was brokered and thereafter implemented. When the Northern Ireland Troubles broke out in 1969, the British government did not rush to intervene and impose a new form of constitutional order between the dominant Unionist community, which was largely Protestant, who wanted to remain part of the United Kingdom, and the minority nationalist community, which was predominantly Catholic, who sought systemic reform, or simply a united Ireland. The British government was very reluctant to involve itself in a dispute that was between two competing nationalisms in Ireland, which are historically premised on two contradictory claims to self-determination, claims which led to partition, the partition of Ireland in 1920. The British had long since hoped that partition had solved the Irish question, whereas Irish nationalists viewed it as a colonial device which prevented them fully realising their national goals and attaining sovereignty for the island as a whole, while Unionists viewed it as a double veto on the question of a united Ireland, in the sense that by establishing the Stormont Parliament in Northern Ireland, they were able to keep the Irish in the south out of Northern Ireland's affairs and maintain a check on any British government that might be tempted to pressure Unionists into a united Ireland at some point in the future. By 1972, the last Unionist Prime Minister, Brian Faulkner, had really failed to contain or quash political and sectarian violence on the streets of Northern Ireland, violence that had morphed from a peaceful civil rights movement which provoked a Protestant loyalist backlash and escalated into an IRA-led insurgency against the Unionist government and against British rule in Northern Ireland, in Ireland. Now, when British troops in Derry, London Derry, shot dead 13 unarmed protesters in January that same year, in what became known as Bloody Sunday, British Prime Minister Edward Heath used this incident as a catalyst with which to convince sceptics in his government that they had to act and they had to take full responsibility for government in Northern Ireland at a moment when there were howls of outcry and protests for the British government, internationally and domestically, to take the political initiative and do something about the escalating violence in Northern Ireland. Now, Heath acted. He suspended the Northern Ireland Parliament, ending just over 50 years of Unionist rule. And in imposing direct rule from Westminster, he tasked his most able colleague, William Whitelaw, with breaking the Unionist community's electoral dominance and thereby ensuring that Northern Ireland was never again administered by a party that drew its support almost entirely from one side of a deeply divided society. 18 months later, following Anglo-Irish agreement at a place called Sunningdale in England, Whitelaw had convinced rival Unionist and nationalist leaders to cross the sectarian divide and form a power-sharing executive at Stormont. Now, Northern Ireland's first power-sharing executive was rather short-lived, however. It fell foul to a mistimed Westminster general election in February 1974, which Conservative Prime Minister Edward Heath lost, and a very un-British coup in May of that same year. The opponents of Heath's Northern Ireland policy, extremists on both sides, and in particular Republican and Loyalist paramilitary organisations, but also Unionist leaders who were excluded from Whitelaw's plans, they set out to remove the idea of mandatory power sharing from the constitutional options that would be available to Northern Ireland should the executive collapse. And they succeeded in this endeavour when Heath's successor, Harold Wilson, failed to protect that executive from an unconstitutional political strike. It was the first time since the Second World War that there had been a significant threat to constitutional government in the United Kingdom. An Ulster Workers' Council became the focal point for opposition to the power-sharing executive from within the largely Protestant Unionist community. And it successfully challenged the authority of the Westminster Parliament to determine what form of government Northern Ireland would have. Taking control of local power stations, electricity generating stations, and bringing the province to the brink of political and economic meltdown through the imposition of a general strike, this Ulster Workers' Council quickly undermined the capacity of the Northern Ireland Executive to do anything, and the Westminster government to administer the province. Now, ignoring calls from the Northern Ireland Executive to break the strike in its first days, Harold Wilson offered no military challenge to the Protestant gangs that were aligned against the executive, for had he done so, the British Army would have been exposed, or might have been exposed, to the venom of both communities in Northern Ireland. A dilemma that was reminiscent of the Hobson's choice that faced the British government after the First World War, whenever it allowed Unionists to set up their own parliament in Northern Ireland and establish their own state within a state. In failing to uphold this constitutional government, Heath was in fact rejecting Heath's idea that the British government should or could provide a solution to Ireland's ancient troubles, either by imposing power sharing or through some other form of direct rule from Westminster. Although Heath viewed Irish unity as something that was in the interests of the British government, his interpretation of how his government should meet its constitutional obligations to Northern Ireland was premised on the reality that it had to resolve and regulate them. It couldn't just leave. But Heath simply did not have the political power to implement the policies that Whitelaw constructed in accordance with that interpretation. Now, Wilson took an altogether different view of Anglo-Irish relations. He set out to dispel Heath's notion that the British government could or should remain responsible for regulating Northern Ireland's troubles. He believed that the conflict should be resolved one way or another by the Irish parties to it. So, although Whitelaw's power-sharing settlement had the potential to successfully reduce and regulate political violence in Northern Ireland, Heath's successor was more inclined to push the province towards independence or dominion status and do away with the idea of power sharing. Once mandatory power sharing had been vanquished, the idea had been defeated, if you like, or destroyed, Whitelaw's policies remained largely redundant until Tony Blair, Labour Prime Minister Tony Blair, swept to power with a huge majority in 1997. The 1998 Belfast Agreement was constructed then after a very lengthy peace process out of the facade of the Whitelaw settlement. Only this time, the British and Irish governments shared a similar view as to the value of applying power sharing to Northern Ireland to resolve its troubles. In 1972, Heath had viewed power sharing as a mechanism by which he might be able to restore order to Northern Ireland and swiftly end direct rule, and thereby allow the British government to relinquish its security and political responsibilities to Northern Ireland. In contrast, in engaging in the negotiations over Northern Ireland, the Irish government viewed power sharing as a device that might force the Unionist community into United Ireland in the short to medium term through powerful All-Ireland institutions that had been agreed between the British and Irish at Sunningdale and which were central to the power-sharing arrangements. Unionist Prime Minister Brian Faulkner's Unionists viewed power-sharing as their last chance to get into government, to determine their own fate, to run a devolved assembly in Northern Ireland. The Unionist opponents of power-sharing viewed it as a device that might very well lead to a united Ireland, and one which had excluded them from power. Thus, they were inadvertently aligned in their opposition to it and in their efforts to destroy the Northern Ireland executive with the Provisional IRA, who saw power-sharing as a threat to its anti-British insurgency, as if power-sharing worked and was seen to work, it might legitimise partition in the eyes of the nationalist community. So to summarise, the governments in Westminster and Dublin that negotiated the accord were weak, and they both viewed the policy of power-sharing primarily from their own national interests, and certainly not from the interests of Northern Ireland, or the Northern Ireland Executive, which they established. By the 1990s, however, both governments had come to view power-sharing as the most realistic means of resolving the Troubles, something they both had an interest in, above and beyond their other interests in Northern Ireland, and something that they worked towards with a unity of purpose. The result? Northern Ireland is today more comfortable in its UK skin than it ever has been at any time since partition, and Ireland is more united than at any point in contemporary Anglo-Irish history. So let me turn briefly now to the hard case of Lebanon. I think it is really hard to imagine a deeply divided society in which the central premise of government and constitution, shared power between different Christian and Muslim communities, has survived so many internal and external existential threats, civil wars, occupations and invasions. And as one US official who was working towards an accord with the Syrians to end Lebanon's civil war just after it began put it, and this could be said of Lebanon today, the centrifugal forces are too strong, the passions too intense, the opportunities and incidents too numerous, and the meddlers, both internal and external, too readily at hand to be contained by anything but unrelenting political process. In Lebanon, the external relationships its different communities hold with patron states has been the key to the success or failure of its political process, or its power-sharing system. More than that, one could say that this has been the defining feature of its politics and power-sharing arrangements. Increasingly so after Lebanon becomes more strategically important after the 1967 Arab-Israeli conflict and the Cold War. And more recently, the post-Cold War struggle over the Middle East, which is shaped to a large extent by US determination to resist the rise of revolutionary Iran and the challenge that it represents to US hegemony in the region. Lebanon is a hostage to that international conflict, and part of Lebanon willingly so. Power sharing in Lebanon predates its independence, yet it remains an unconsolidated state. Unlike Northern Ireland, Lebanon has a rich tradition and history and culture of pluralism and coexistence between its different Christian and Muslim communities. But the search for peace and stability in Lebanon has consistently been hampered by the lack of positive external support for the implementation and the stabilisation of its power-sharing arrangements. When compared to Northern Ireland today, it is clear that a unity of purpose among those intervening and meddling in Lebanon in its political process has generally been absent. Although at times international arrangements and factors have been positive for successfully stabilising the country, but not resolving its conflicts. For the most part, intervening states have lacked an interest in providing its power-sharing arrangements with an overarching support that goes beyond the interests that they're playing out through that divided society. They continue to pursue their rivalries there. The political process that brought about Lebanon's independence was the outcome of external competition for influence in the Middle East during the Second World War. Under pressure from their British allies, the Free French reluctantly fulfilled France's mandate commitments to grant Lebanon's independence in 1943. Lebanon emerged as an independent state during the war through an unwritten agreement between its dominant Maronite Christian and Sunni Muslim communities, the leaders of those communities, and this became known as the 1943 National Pact. This arrangement collapsed completely, however, when Lebanon experienced a lengthy and consumptive civil war between 1975 and 89, the end of which saw peace imposed upon Lebanon through Syrian hegemonic control or rule from 1990 to 2005, after which Lebanon has experienced a period of semi-independence from 2005 to today, a period which has been marked by political violence and political instability. In contrast to Northern Ireland, and very much like Iraq, Lebanon's power-sharing institutions are in limbo. It has been incrementally edging towards civil war since the unscripted departure of the Syrian forces that occupied the country since 1976. The catalyst for their withdrawal was the assassination of former Lebanese Prime Minister Rafi Hariri on Valentine's Day 2005. But Syrian isolation in the Middle East was provoked by the interventionist policies of the United States after 9/11, and most particularly the 2003 invasion of Iraq. Now, although Lebanon enjoyed a period of economic prosperity in the 1950s and 60s, its government failed to modernise and politically adjust its power-sharing arrangements to meet escalating pressures for constitutional reform. However, it did take an external catalyst to provoke the collapse of Lebanon's national pact, and with it, the collapse of the state. Following the 1967 Arab-Israeli War, the presence of armed Palestinian Liberation Organization fighters in Lebanon exacerbated existing tensions within its government. Muslim ministers needed to be seen to support the Palestinian cause in Lebanon. In contrast, Christian leaders did not want the PLO furthering its cause in Lebanon at Lebanon's expense, nor prompting Israeli reprisals in Lebanon against the PLO. By 1975, the PLO was operating as a state within a state, and the following year a coalition of leftist opposition groups challenging Lebanon's political status quo joined forces with the PLO and attempted to take over the state. To counter this, an attempt was made to end the civil war by modifying Lebanon's 1943 power-sharing arrangements through a Syrian-sponsored peace agreement known as the Constitutional Document. This peace attempt had the backing of the US, and Secretary of State Henry Kissinger brokered an informal agreement by which Syria could intervene in Lebanon to prevent a Christian collapse and to rein in the PLO without provoking a reciprocal military response from the Israelis. In other words, there was a momentary alignment of US, Syrian and Israeli interests in Lebanon that offered hope for peace. The agreement failed, however. Syrian occupation was internationally legitimised, and the war continued sucking Lebanon deeper and deeper into the Arab-Israeli conflict. In 1989, another alignment in international relations offered Lebanon a lifeline. Its pre-Civil War leaders reached a power-sharing agreement at Taif in Saudi Arabia, which allowed Syria to militarily end the conflict and the Lebanese to reformulate their national pact exactly along the lines, or almost along the lines, of the 1976 constitutional document. So, what did the idea of power sharing mean to those who established the pact in 1943 and those who failed to reformulate it and end its civil war in 1976 and those who then successfully did so in 1989? What did it mean? Well, the National Pact was premised on the negation of two contradictory national aspirations or claims to self-determination. On the one hand, there were Arab nationalists who were predominantly Sunni, who, in order to gain independence, set aside their desire to be part of a greater Syrian state. And on the other hand, there were Lebanese nationalists who were predominantly Maronite Christians who set aside their desire for the establishment of a smaller, Western-orientated Christian state. By pooling their political resources, they achieved independence. And for once, external competition for influence in the Middle East proved highly positive for Lebanon. The National Pact, however, was premised on foreign policy neutrality, like Switzerland. Lebanon would not seek Western protection, and while having an Arab face, Lebanon would stay out of regional conflicts and inter-Arab conflicts. This was the kernel of the compromise that took place between Arab nationalists and Lebanese nationalists. And it worked well enough when there were no great external pressures put upon the Lebanese to take sides in the Arab-Israeli wars or in the Cold War. So in much the same way that the solution to Northern Ireland's troubles was evident in 1973, the compromise that ended Lebanon's civil war in 1989 was negotiated by Lebanon's elites in 1976, the same people. Henry Kissinger had spotted a Cold War opportunity out of Lebanon's collapse. Thus, the US accepted a Syrian solution to its civil war. In doing so, Henry Kissinger sought to bring Syria into the Western sphere of influence, as a Middle East peace process was really taking shape between Egypt and Israel, and at a time when both Israel and Syria were determined, one way or another, to reduce the PLO's influence in Lebanon. So the US wanted to split Syria from Moscow. Israel wanted to stop PLO attacks on its territory, and Syria wanted to control the PLO in its bid to attain strategic parity with Israel and comparative advantage over its Arab competitors. For the part of the Lebanese ruling elite, they simply wanted to reform their system and get themselves back into government, but they had absolutely no power to do so. In 1989, the United States and Saudi Arabia set out to Arabize the solution to Lebanon's civil war, and what that meant was limiting Syria's control over Lebanon at a moment when Soviet influence, remember we're getting towards the end of the Cold War, in the Middle East was in decline. As the only military force capable of containing Lebanon's civil war, Syrian President Hafez al-Assad maintained his position that there would be no solution to the Lebanon conflict that did not first and foremost suit Syria's interests. Agreement was reached and that Lebanon would return to its old power-sharing system of government, and Syria would assist Lebanon in the restoration of state sovereignty, re-establish the state's territorial integrity, disarm its militias and restructure its army, while the United States and the wealthy Gulf states would politically and financially oversee and support this process. The Lebanese negotiators at Taif hoped that the agreement would mark the beginning of the restoration of the sovereignty that their state had lost under the PLO in the 1970s before the state finally collapsed. But when Syria joined the anti-Saddam coalition following Iraq's invasion of Kuwait, providing much-needed Arab legitimacy to Western intervention in the Middle East, pressure on Assad to fully implement the agreement was turned down, if not off. Following the 1991 Gulf War, Syria quickly excluded those parties whose aim had been, in accepting the agreement, to re-establish Lebanon's sovereignty through its old power-sharing institutions. Assad had absolutely no intention of allowing Lebanon to return to its pre-war foreign policy neutrality, regardless of the fact that it was exactly the departure from that principle that had brought about the collapse of the state in the first place. Thus, Lebanon did not regain its lost sovereignty in 1989, and the form of power sharing that it experienced up until the withdrawal of Syrian forces in 2005 amounted to little more than government by proxy from Damascus. So the contemporary history of Lebanon and Lebanese power sharing arrangements is a story of a country that has been trapped and remains almost entirely hostage to external intervention and events that are beyond its control. Lebanon has rarely experienced external intervention like that it experienced during the Second World War. Now, that is, of course, not to say that the Lebanese are blameless. They are not. For at times of crisis, Lebanon's confessional leaders eagerly harness their communities to competing foreign powers in bids to maximize their own political authority in Lebanon, in the game of musical chairs that Lebanon's power-sharing government represents. Fulfilling and building upon the promise of Lebanon's Taif Agreement is closely linked to the establishment of a regional accord that might promote peaceful coexistence in Lebanon as an interest in and of itself, as it has been promoted in Northern Ireland. There is presently no power capable of bringing this about, nor does a regional balance of power exist that might result in an equilibrium that facilitates this. Although recent events in Syria provide some cause for optimism, there has clearly been a realignment in international relations between the US and Russia over Syria, which Iran and Lebanon are, of course, integral parties to. Lebanon's power-sharing arrangements may survive the civil war that is presently being fought out in neighbouring Syria, and Lebanon's history would suggest that it will. It survived the 20th century. Its future, however, is definitely tied to the outcome of that conflict. And we should also remember, or consider, that this is no longer a Lebanese problem in the Middle East. It is also an Iraqi problem, and potentially a Syrian one too. So, to conclude, it has been said that politics is the art of ever-recurring negotiation. And this is especially true in deeply divided societies. For power-sharing arrangements to peaceably manage ethnic conflicts, agreement must be reached, very often in constructively ambiguous terms, where more than one party can sell a peace accord to its own community as a victory rather than a compromise or a surrender, and one that recognises and secures the constitutional issues that they are in conflict over, and one that respects and maintains their identities. This enables those parties to a conflict that are herded onto that very narrow piece of common ground where they may be able to coexist peaceably in the long term, and enables them to make the transition from rigidly sticking to the ideological positions that lock their communities in conflict towards a time when they can accept and support governmental institutions that are premised on letting go of the safe uncertainties of conflict and engaging in government-based and consensus and compromise. Equally importantly, while their interests in resolving a conflict need not be synonymous, there must be agreement between the states that exercised influence in herding those parties onto that piece of common ground, that narrow ground. More than that, if they can act with a unity of purpose in implementing power-sharing arrangements, then the chances of a successful outcome to that political process are surely greatly enhanced. Engaging in power-sharing is an admirable venture, but it requires consistency and it requires patience, for it may very well take a generation or more to establish peaceful coexistence in a deeply divided society. So for Western governments and policymakers seeking to intervene and promote this model in societies fractured by ethnic conflict, I would offer 4 pieces of advice that may enhance their chances of success in promoting this model. Firstly, the policy of applying power sharing must be fully developed prior to the external intervention, which was certainly not the case in Northern Ireland in 1972 and not the case in Iraq in 2003. Secondly, there needs to be international agreement between states with an interest in a contested territory over what it means, what is the objective of applying this method of conflict resolution. If they all have conflicting objectives, then it is unlikely to work or stabilize. Third, the intervening states must have a strong interest, an interest in the long term in truly bringing about peaceful coexistence and security to the peoples of that, to their kin peoples in many cases of that society. And finally, those states must have the political power and the political authority to negotiate a peace accord, to legitimize its new institutions and power-sharing arrangements, to consolidate them over time, and to begin to heal the deep divisions and social traumas that are part and parcel of being human and surviving the experience of civil war and ethnic conflict. So, to finish on a quote from perhaps the greatest living American writer, Cormac McCarthy, from the first part of his Border trilogy, All the Pretty Horses. Scars have the strange power to remind us that our past is real. The closest bonds we will ever know are bonds of grief. The deepest community, one of sorrow. And nowhere is that more true than in divided societies that have experienced protracted ethnic conflict or civil war. Thank you.
Good evening. I'll be very brief, but to begin with, I would like to thank Professor O'Brien for coming here tonight and for chairing the event. And I would also like to thank all of you for coming tonight. You know, this is a great turnout, and I think it's a real acknowledgement and a fitting acknowledgement of Michael's achievement in being appointed to the Chair in Conflict Studies in the Middle East and Mediterranean Studies here at King's. Second, and in case I forget at the end, my most important task is to remind you that following soon after my conclusion, you're all invited to a reception upstairs in chapters, and I hope you all can come. And third, I would like to thank the man of the hour, Professor Michael Kerr, for asking me to give this vote of thanks here tonight. I believe that the tradition usually has it that a vote of thanks is given by an esteemed colleague from outside King's in the field. But it appears that they all chose to go to the Hamlet event tonight instead. And being more of a King Lear man myself, it was left for me to do it. Now, for those of you who did choose this inaugural lecture over Hamlet, or, to be honest, who are we kidding, over the Great British Bake Off, which starts on BBC 2 in about 20 minutes, I think it's fair to say that you all chose right. Michael, you spoke brilliantly on a fascinating subject that gave us all a great insight into the importance of the work that you do, why it matters to you, and why it should matter to us. And before I go on, I just want to say a special welcome tonight to someone who makes an appearance at almost all Michael's talks. No matter what the subject, the audience, the location, he's always here. And that's the author, Graham Greene. Tonight he made a brief appearance. Usually he appears verbatim and in long passages, regardless of his relevance to the subject matter or the title of the talk. But listening to Michael tonight, I understand why. Because it seems that Greene, like Michael, knew that in the final account, it's all about the human condition. As he said once in one of his novels, human nature is not black and white, but black and grey. And I think Michael in tonight's talk made it very clear that that's what he thinks too. And tonight you showed why, I really think you showed why you are the leading world expert on comparative aspects of power sharing in Lebanon and Northern Ireland. Certainly British diplomats, as well as Lebanese politicians, have recognized that for a number of years now. So have your colleagues in MEMS, and so have the students from over 50 countries who you've taught since you've arrived at King's. And so, believe it or not, have many in the most divided community of all, the community of scholars working on power sharing. Although they may not admit it in public. One of the more fascinating ideas you put forward tonight, in what was a fascinating talk all round, is that power sharing usually occurs in deeply divided societies where local parties just want to be left alone, but cannot achieve isolation on their own. A second, and I thought you showed it very well, was the key role of external parties in making power sharing a success or a failure. You know, it has long been said that tolerance is 9 parts indifference to 1 part brotherly love. And in your research, Michael, I think it's clear that you showed that it's not enough for external powers to be indifferent. They have to play an actively positive role in promoting power sharing for it to have any chance at all of succeeding. And I think in recent years, Northern Ireland, as you have shown in a number of your writings, is a great example of the benefits of external parties playing a positive role in making power sharing a reality. Lebanon, alas, less so. But the lessons of both for each other, for other divided societies, in terms of how, why, and to what end external parties act and should act, is one of the great contributions that you have made to the field. And it continues to be at the heart of much of the important work that you do today. And this can be a thankless task, no doubt. As you acknowledge yourself in your talk, finding ways for ethnic, ethno-national, and religious enemies to live together despite historical baggage and ideological differences and just pure human nature is no easy task. Now, part of my own work deals with the Arab-Israeli conflict, and once I was asked how one could manage to keep upbeat while working on a subject despite the intractable nature of the conflict, the interminable violence, the political cynicism, and the human tragedy. And my answer, and I was only half joking, was to drink heavily and not watch the news. And I know for a fact that Michael still watches the news. He drinks heavily while doing so, but he still refuses to avoid all the misery. He faces it head on. And I think that tells us a lot about his approach to work and his approach to life. You know, Michael likes to present himself as a cynic and as a pessimist, and no doubt, in part, he is. And there is nothing wrong with that at all. William Burroughs, the author, once said that a pessimist is nothing more than a well-informed optimist. And Michael is very well-informed indeed on so many of these subjects. He revels in reminding his students not simply that the good guys don't always win, but that often there are no good guys. And yet, Michael has spent much of his career giving peace a chance, and then another chance, and then another chance after that. And it is this refusal to give up on the merits and the value and the importance of power sharing in practice and not just in theory, as evidenced by his work with David Trimble in selling the idea to a sceptical and divided Northern Irish electorate, that offers the greatest evidence, I think, deep down, no matter how hard he tries to hide it with deeply depressing Cormac McCarthy quotes to finish his talk, that Michael is basically an optimist. And I apologize now in advance if I insult you with what I'm going to say next, and that you have a deep faith in the human capacity for doing the right thing. But you know, Michael, you're much, much more than that too. Though dealing with serious issues, you've never taken life too seriously. A number of years before he was appointed to his post at King's, he was interviewed for a post at a distinguished think tank in London. And by distinguished, I mean stuffy and out of touch. And his interviewer, a retired senior military officer, asked him if he knew the difference between an Exocet and a Patriot missile. And Michael answered, no, but I know the difference between a Molotov cocktail and a hand grenade. Now, suffice to say, Michael didn't get the job, and suffice to say, he probably was glad that he didn't get the job. Now, some years ago, I read that a young academic, starting out in his career, approached a senior Don and asked him for advice. And the veteran professor's response is one that I have never forgotten. He said, don't try to be clever. There are lots of clever people here. Try to be kind. And it is sage advice, and I think that in the many years I have known Michael, he has lived up to this advice. The esteem in which he is held by his colleagues, the esteem in which he is held by his students, is a testament to that. And for me personally, it's a real privilege to work with someone who is not simply a great scholar, and not simply a great teacher, but a wonderful friend for many years. And I give thanks for that, not just tonight, but on a daily basis. And so thank you, Michael, and thank you all for coming tonight, and I hope you enjoy the rest of the evening. Thank you.